By the summer of the year 2000, the civil war in Sierra Leone had been raging for over a decade. In the jungle, the West Side Boys were an armed guerrilla group who styled themselves on American gangster culture, reported by the BBC as wearing bizarre clothing, women's wigs and flip-flops, and being almost perpetually drunk. They believed themselves invulnerable to bullets. On the 25th of August, a vehicle patrol consisting of 11 soldiers of the Royal Irish Regiment and a Sierra Leone Army liaison officer entered the territory of the West Side Boys and suddenly found themselves surrounded by an armed and hostile crowd. Taken prisoner, the men were held in a fortified jungle hideout, adorned with the severed heads of the West Side Boys' previous conquests. When negotiations for the soldiers' release were stalled, the joint rescue mission was launched, codename Operation Barras. This is the story of one of the most daring Special Forces ops since World War II, a mission so dangerous it was nicknamed Operation Certain Death. Welcome to Wars of the World. At the beginning of the 21st century, the West African country of Sierra Leone was in anarchy. The nation had been devastated by corruption, violence, and political instability for decades. Finally, in 1991, it all came to a head when a full-scale civil war broke out, as the rebel forces of the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, attempted to overthrow the government. The RUF, with no political objectives, were just a brutal group of terrorists, driven by nothing more than a lust for power and the wealth that came from controlling the country's rich diamond mines. Stories of the widespread rape, murder, and mutilation inflicted on their victims soon spread throughout the world. The RUF was notorious for using amputation as a form of torture, as well as the trafficking of women and girls for use as sex slaves. They terrorized villages and forced fathers to watch while their daughters were gang raped. Young boys were made to torture and kill their own families in an attempt to dehumanize and brutalize them before they were taken and made to join the rebels. In April of 2000, with the RUF about to advance on the capital city of Freetown, British forces, spearheaded by the Parachute Regiment, were drafted in an attempt to evacuate all British and Allied nationals to safety. Following the immediate suppression of the rebel threat, an international military and training team was put together. 3 months later, the Royal Irish Regiment arrived to teach the SLA, the Sierra Leone Army, basic military discipline and combat tactics. The ultimate goal was for the SLA to defeat the rebels and to bring stability back to the ravaged country. Originally involved in the war, the West Side Boys were a militia group initially loyal to the Revolutionary United Front, the rebel army that opposed the Sierra Leone government. At one point, they switched sides and fought against the RUF on the side of the government in exchange for medical supplies and weapons. However, they refused to join the SLA and they preferred to operate as bandits. The main reason they got their name came from their love of music of the American rapper Tupac Shakur. After the rebels seized power in 1997, the jails in Freetown were opened up, spilling out hundreds of thieves, rapists, murderers, and various other unsavory characters. Along with some former SL Army members, civilians, and boy soldiers who were counted among the ranks of the West Side Boys. Dressed in shower caps and fluorescent wigs, and using voodoo charm tattoos to ensure their invincibility, they were either high on drugs or drunk on sweet palm wine most of the time. Some of these Westsiders gave themselves inflated titles and army ranks with strange names, such as Brigadier Bombblast, Colonel Cambodia, or Commander Cut Hands. On the 25th of August 2000, Major Alan Marshall, led his patrol out of their base at Waterloo, the capital of the Western Area Rural District of Sierra Leone. They were escorting an official from the SLA named Lieutenant Musa Bangura to the town of Masiaka. When there, he was to meet with Jordanian peacekeepers attached to the United Nations mission in Sierra Leone. On their return, the patrol was advised to investigate the remote villages around the Rokel Creek area to see if access could be provided for aid agencies to help any of the civilians there. But it was a dangerous decision, as the area was also deep in the West Side Boys territory. Turning off the main route, the British soldiers found themselves travelling on a heavily rutted dirt track, deeper and deeper into the jungle. As they reached a clearing, suddenly a rebel holding a machine gun stepped in front of the lead Land Rover, and the Brits found themselves surrounded by around 150 West Side Boys, with other rebels pointing rocket-propelled grenade launchers at them from either side. A Bedford cut-off lorry mounted with a double-barreled ZPU-2 quickly drove in behind, blocking off any chance of an escape route. The British soldiers were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. Major Marshall tried to reason with the rebel leader, who called himself Colonel Savage, but fueled by alcohol, drugs, and the boisterous nature of one another, the group beat the soldiers and disarmed them. They were then taken hostage and transported across the river in canoes to the West Siders' headquarters in Gaberi Bana to meet with their boss, Brigadier Fode Calais. The negotiations were led by Colonel Simon Fordham, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment. He was accompanied by a small team, which included Metropolitan Police hostage negotiators flown in from London. Fordham had to meet with Fode Calais at the end of the track to the village of Magbeni, as he wouldn't allow the men to come any closer. On August 29th, Fordham demanded proof of life, so Calais took Marshal and Signals Officer Captain Ed Flaherty with him to the meeting. On shaking hands with Fordham, Flaherty secretly passed over a detailed map of Gaberi Bana village, showing the building in which the soldiers were being held prisoner, along with some detailed notes on the rebels' weaponry and defences. 2 days later, 5 of the hostages were released in exchange for medical supplies and a satellite phone. Then, Colonel Cambodia, self-appointed spokesperson for the West Side Boys, contacted the BBC, using the satellite phone to conduct a rambling interview where he laid out their demands. They included the release of the prisoners held by Sierra Leone authorities and a renegotiation of the Lomé Peace Accord. Colonel Cambodia spent so much time on the phone that the batteries eventually died out, but the fact that he had been on the phone for so long helped to assist the Royal Corps of Signals to pinpoint their exact location. It was around that time that 2 SAS negotiators were eventually brought in. Because of the way the West Side Boys were split over 2 camps, their main headquarters at Gaberi Bana and the village of Magbeni on the opposite sides of the river, it was clear that the SAS could not simply conduct a rescue mission alone. So the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment assembled an augmented company to support the Special Forces. On the 2nd of September, 2 SAS observation teams were embedded near the village, one on either side of Rokel Creek. The assault boats that took them in were manned by the SBS, the Royal Navy's Special Boat Service. All the movements of the West Side Boys was being monitored, using high-tech listening equipment and vision enhancers, gathering intelligence and identifying helicopter landing sites. A Company would lead the assault on Magbeni to the south, while D Squadron SAS would release the Royal Irish soldiers in the north at Gaberi Bana. Due to the terrain, a decision was made not to use an overland approach to send in the troops. Instead, 3 Royal Air Force Special Forces Chinook helicopters from No. 7 Squadron were to be used for the task. On 9th of September, Colonel Cambodia made a new demand. The remaining hostages would only be released after a new government was formed in Sierra Leone. Concerns were mounting that these demands were simply a stalling tactic, so the captive soldiers could be moved further inland, and so a decision was made to order the assault. The operation began at dawn the next day, with the 2 villages stormed at the same time. The rescue teams were also tasked with the extraction of Lieutenant Musa Bangura, the SLA liaison. Once the SAS observation team were in a position to prevent the West Side Boys from killing any of the captives when they heard the incoming helicopters, the task force went in. The Chinooks blew off the corrugated iron roofs of several village huts, including the one on the building where the Royal Irish were held, as the helicopters flew low up the line of the Roquel Creek. On their approach, the SAS observation team engaged with the West Side Boys at Gaberi Bana. The Chinooks used M134 miniguns to fire on the area, while 2 Lynx helicopters blitzed the villages to make landing zones and destroy any heavy weaponry. The SAS troopers fast roped into the village and came under immediate fire. Despite this opposition, they cleared the village, capturing any rebels that surrendered, including the West Side Boys leader, Fode Calais. The British soldiers were easily located, but Lieutenant Bangura was found in a fetid pit that the West Side Boys had used as an open latrine. Starved, beaten, and having drunk only filthy rainwater and stale urine for over 2 weeks, he had to be carried to safety. It took less than 20 minutes from the start of the mission for all remaining members of the Royal Irish and Bangura to be evacuated. 22 Sierra Leonean civilians were also freed. The West Side Boys had been using the men as servants and the women as sex slaves. At Magbeni, A Company from 1st Para had dropped into swampy ground before making their way to the village. Each platoon assaulted a cluster of buildings, and the ammunition store was located and locked down. By 0800, the village was completely secure, and Claymore explosives had been laid on the approaches to prevent any counterattack. A jungle search began to find any West Side Boys who might be hiding in the bush. Vehicles and heavy weapons were destroyed, including the Bedford lorry and the ZPU-2 that had blocked the Royal Irish Patrol 17 days earlier. Paras also recovered the British Land Rovers. They were slung under the Chinooks and removed. It was at approximately 1400 when the last British soldiers left the area. At RFA Sir Percival, the remaining members of the captured patrol were visited by Colonel Fordham. He stated that, quote, "They looked remarkably well considering the ordeal they had been through, although they were physically and mentally exhausted." End quote. Once medical checks were done, the Royal Irish soldiers were allowed to telephone their loved ones before rejoining their battalion in Freetown. Several gallantry medals were given to those who took part in Operation Varus. It was the first operation where the SAS was sent to rescue other members of the British Army. 12 British soldiers were injured during the rescue, one being seriously wounded. SAS trooper Bradley Tinian was killed in action, having been seriously injured early on in the confrontation. As many as 80 of the West Side Boys were thought to have died. Several were captured and others surrendered. Within 2 weeks of Operation Barras, 371 West Siders were in the hands of Jordanian peacekeepers. Calais, who was imprisoned, broadcast a message on Sierra Leone radio appealing for the remaining West Side Boys to surrender. The country's Minister for Information declared that the rebel gang was finished as a military threat. 2 years later, when the civil war had finally ended in Sierra Leone, it was estimated that 2.5 million people had been displaced, with somewhere between 50 to 70,000 casualties.